The teacher held up Trevian's essay and laughed. "There's no way you wrote this." The class erupted, but Trevian didn't flinch. He just stared, humiliated, as his words were torn apart. In the back, the door creaked open, and in walked a 68-year-old black grandmother. No one had seen in years. She didn't say a word, but what she pulled from her purse changed everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun spilled softly across the cracked sidewalks of Dalton, Georgia, coating the small town in a warm glow that almost made the world seem fair. Birds chirped without worry. School buses hissed to a stop at every corner, and 12-year-old Trevian Jackson, dressed neatly in his navy blue hoodie and pressed jeans, walked through the gates of Milton Middle School. Gripping his backpack straps with quiet confidence, his thoughts raced, not with anxiety, but with excitement. Today, his history essay would be returned, and Trevian knew he had written something powerful. For weeks, their class had been studying American history. When Mr. Langston assigned an essay on voices that shaped America, most of Trevian's classmates chose the same recycled names: Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy, Benjamin Franklin. But Trevian had gone another way. He'd written about Fannie Lou Hamer, Claudette Colvin, and Bayard Rustin, names that often disappeared between the textbook lines. His essay didn't just present facts, it bled emotion and thought, challenging what it meant to be a patriot and who got to be remembered. He was proud of every word. The hallway buzzed with life as he made his way to classroom 2C. Sneakers squeaking on polished tile, lockers slamming shut, chatter echoing off the beige walls. He passed groups of kids clustered by water fountains and stairwells, most of them still half asleep. But Trevian felt fully alive. There was something electric in the air. He took his seat in the second row, directly beneath the faded "In God We Trust" poster, and laid his notebook on the desk, spine perfectly aligned. He was ready. Mr. Langston entered moments later, tie straight, hair combed, that faint cologne trailing him like a badge of control. He carried a stack of essays in one arm, his expression unreadable. Students hushed on cue. Mr. Langston didn't need to yell. His authority didn't rise. It slithered. Without preamble, he slapped the stack of papers on his desk, straightened them, and looked up. "Before we begin today's lesson," he said, "I'd like to address something troubling." Trevian sat up straighter. He had no reason to be nervous, until Mr. Langston's gaze fixed squarely on him. "Mr. Jackson," he said, voice smooth and laced with condescension, "would you mind joining me up here?" A few kids turned in their seats. Trevian froze. He blinked, confused, unsure what he had done wrong. Slowly, he stood and walked to the front of the class, heart thudding against his ribs. Mr. Langston held up Trevian's essay between two fingers, as if afraid to touch it. "Class," he said, "we have an excellent example of an essay here. It's almost too excellent." Laughter trickled from a few desks. Trevian shifted uncomfortably. "I've taught for 23 years, Mr. Langston continued, and I've never seen writing like this from a 7th grader. In fact, I found it so advanced, I suspected it wasn't original." Trevian's stomach dropped. "I ran this essay through 2 different plagiarism detectors," Langston said, waving a printed screenshot of the results. "No matches. But that doesn't prove authorship." Then, with a grin that never touched his eyes, he began to read aloud. It was Trevian's writing, but in Mr. Langston's voice, the sentences sounded like evidence. His tone dripped with sarcasm, as he emphasized words like institutional oppression and systemic marginalization, as if they didn't belong in a middle schooler's mouth. He writes, "America cannot heal until she first listens to the wounds she refuses to see." A powerful line, or borrowed. The class burst into muffled laughter. Someone whispered, "No way he wrote that." Another, "He Googled it for sure." Trevian felt his face burn. His breath caught in his throat. He looked at Mr. Langston, silently begging him to stop. But the teacher just kept going. "Did you write this, Trevian?" he asked, finally pausing. "Yes," Trevian said, voice cracking. "I wrote every word." Mr. Langston raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because I would expect this kind of writing from, say, a college freshman. Not a boy who, well, not a boy like you." There it was. Not a boy like you. Trevian heard the unsaid words, screaming louder than the ones spoken. The class fell into an awkward silence. No one defended him. No one looked at him. Mr. Langston returned the essay to his desk with a sigh, as though he was the one disappointed. "You may sit down." Trevian returned to his seat, throat tight, vision blurry. Shame crawled across his skin like fire ants. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the floor, to scream, but he did nothing, just sat there as the lesson moved on like nothing had happened. By lunch, the whispers had grown. Kids passed his desk with smirks, mimicking his essay lines with exaggerated accents. She must listen to the wounds, one boy mocked, holding a hand over his heart like a preacher. Damn, Trey, you gonna run for president or what? Another laughed. He didn't go to lunch. He told the teacher he had a headache and went to the nurse's office instead. The nurse asked if he wanted to call home, but Trevian shook his head. What could he even say? That his teacher thought he was too smart to be black. So he sat alone on the cot in the dim nurse's office, staring at the ceiling, fingers clenched around his hoodie strings. Somewhere inside him, something shifted, not cracked, not snapped, just shifted. A part of him understood something he hadn't before. That being excellent didn't always earn respect. Sometimes it invited suspicion, especially when your skin told a different story than they expected. And as he sat there, eyes glassy and body stiff, across town in a quiet kitchen filled with the scent of jasmine tea and old wood, someone else felt something shift too. Lila Jackson, 68 years old, sat in her rocking chair reading the morning paper when her body went still. She hadn't gotten a call from the school. She hadn't checked social media, but she knew her grandson. She knew his silences, his patterns. She could feel when something wasn't right. She stood up slowly, knees cracking, and walked to her bedroom. She opened a drawer and pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed and brittle with time. Inside was her own school essay, the one her teacher once accused her of stealing, the one no one believed she'd written. That pain buried for decades flared like an old wound struck by lightning.
Lila didn't need proof.
She needed answers. She slipped on her shoes, picked up her cane, but while Trevian sat in the nurse's office, too ashamed to call home, someone was already on their way. Someone who had lived this fight before. Lila Jackson had never been a woman who needed noise to make herself known. At 68, she carried a presence carved from decades of surviving what others did not see, and would never fully understand. The morning she stepped out of her house, cane tapping softly against the wooden porch, there was nothing dramatic about her movements. No frantic pacing, no shaking hands, just a steady determination that fagger beneath her ribs, like a rising storm. She didn't know the details of what had happened at school, but she knew her grandson's silence too well. Trevian didn't hide fear unless he believed speaking would only make things worse, and that kind of silence, sharp, wounded, and unfamiliar, never lied to her. As she reached her old sedan, she paused for a brief moment, pressing her fingertips against the chipped blue paint. Lord, she murmured softly, let me walk in with the strength my boy needs today. Then she opened the door, settled into the seat, and drove toward Milton Middle School, with a calm that was anything but peaceful. The road stretched ahead of her, framed by trees already losing their leaves, but her mind was elsewhere, deep in the halls of her own past, where humiliation had once lived like a permanent shadow. She remembered Louisiana in the late 1960s, remembered being the only black girl in a school built to remind her that she didn't belong. She remembered the chalk dust that coated the air, the whispers that followed her like a trail, the teachers who never called on her unless it was to correct her. She remembered the essay she had written in 8th grade about equality, an essay she had been proud of, an essay her teacher had torn apart in front of the class with a laugh that still echoed in her bones. This is too good for you, the teacher had said. Try writing something believable next time. And the class had laughed, because their teacher taught them who deserved dignity and who did not. She had swallowed tears so bitter they burned her throat. She had gone home and promised herself she would never let a child endure what she endured that day. That memory rose again, uninvited but unmistakable, as she pulled into Milton Middle School's parking lot. The building was modern brick, with glass windows and a pristine lawn, but to Lila, it might as well have been the same Louisiana school from 50 years ago. The architecture changed, the decades changed, but she knew from experience that racism didn't need the same walls to survive. It lived in the people, in their assumptions, in the places where black children were taught they were too much, or not enough. She stepped out of the car slowly, gripping her cane. Her back ached with age, but her spirit stood taller than the flagpole out front. As she made her way toward the entrance, several teachers standing near the doorway glanced her way, some offering polite nods, others exchanging curious looks. Lila wasn't dressed in anything flashy. A long gray cardigan, a navy blouse, and neatly pressed slacks. But it wasn't the clothing that made people pause. It was the way she walked, as though she belonged in every space she entered, as though time itself moved out of respect for her steps. Inside, the front office buzzed with morning chaos. Phones ringing, printers humming, students dropping off late slips. Yet when Lila pushed open the glass door, the room seemed to tighten. She approached the counter with quiet confidence. The receptionist, a young woman with a tight bun and a forced smile, greeted her with polite formality. "Good morning. Can I help you?" "Yes," Lila replied, her voice even and calm. "My grandson, Travian Jackson, is here. I need to see him." The receptionist clicked her pen, glancing at the computer as though searching for the right protocol. "Do you have an appointment with the counselor or principal?" "No," Lila said plainly. "I'm his guardian, and I'm here to see him." The receptionist hesitated, her smile tightening around the edges. "Unfortunately, walk-ins aren't encouraged during class hours. If you'd like, I can schedule something for you this afternoon." Lila didn't blink. "I'll wait." "Oh, well, the principal is in a meeting. It might be a while." The woman attempted again. "I said," Lila repeated gently but firmly. "I'll wait." The room fell into a strange quiet. Not intimidating, not hostile. Simply a silence that held weight. Lila lowered herself into the plastic chair nearest the counter, her cane leaning against her knee. She didn't fidget or sigh or ask for updates. She simply sat as still as an old tree with roots that refused to be moved. The receptionist pretended to get busy, pretending not to study her. But something in Lila's posture, something in the steady, patient fire in her face, made the young woman shift uncomfortably in her seat. No raised voice, no accusation, yet everyone in the room felt the force of her presence. Minutes rolled into longer minutes. A bell rang. Students passed by the office window, their books clutched to their chests, and all the while Lila waited, back straight, eyes forward, each breath deliberate. She had learned a long time ago that silence could be louder than any shout, that sometimes the quietest people carried the strongest storms. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, the receptionist cleared her throat. "Ma'am," the nurse just radioed in. "It seems your grandson isn't in class today. He's in the health office." Lila's eyes lifted. "Is he hurt?" "I'm not sure," the receptionist replied. "But the nurse said he looked upset this morning." Something in Lila's chest tightened. Not alarm yet, but an old familiar ache. She rose slowly, adjusting her cardigan. "Take me to him." The receptionist opened her mouth as though to object again, but this time nothing came out. She stood, motioned toward the hallway, and led Lila through the school. Students lined the lockers, chatting, laughing, oblivious to the quiet storm moving past them. Some glanced at Lila, others didn't. But the few who did felt compelled to step aside, sensing something in her presence they couldn't name. As they approached the nurse's office, Lila's heart beat harder, not fast but deep, each thump echoing like an old drum carrying history with it. She thought of Trevian as a baby, with curls soft as cotton and eyes full of curiosity. She thought of him last year, beaming with pride as he showed her the essay he'd written about Frederick Douglass, saying, "Grandma, writing feels like breathing." And she thought of him yesterday evening, quiet at dinner, pushing peas around his plate in a way she hadn't seen before. The receptionist knocked gently on the door before opening it. The nurse looked up from her desk, startled and unsure. "Can I help you?" Lila stepped inside without waiting to be invited. "Where is my grandson?" The nurse hesitated, then nodded toward the small cot in the corner. Lila turned, her breath catching in her throat at the sight of him. Trevian sat hunched over, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. His eyes were red, not from crying recently, but from trying not to cry for far too long. He stared at the floor, lost in a world she couldn't yet see. "Trey," she whispered softly, and his head lifted slowly, confusion flickering before recognition. Then the emotion hit him sharp, raw, unguarded. "Grandma?" His voice cracked, barely above a whisper. Lila walked toward him, each step heavier than the last. When she finally reached him, her hand hovered for a moment, before she touched his cheek. It was warm and damp, tear-streaked, but trying so hard to be brave. "What happened, baby?" she asked quietly. "Tell me what they did." He swallowed hard, the shame in his eyes deeper than anything a child should ever know. "Grandma, he said I didn't write it. He made the class laugh. He said someone like me couldn't write something good." Lila froze, not in shock, but in recognition. The words hit her like an old ghost returning to reclaim what it once took. And in that moment, she realized something chilling, something she had prayed would never be true. This wasn't just a bad teacher. This was a pattern, a cycle, a wound passed from her generation to his. Because as Lila held her grandson's trembling hands, she realized this wasn't just a bad teacher. It was something bigger, and it had already begun tightening its grip around him. The nurse's office still smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale tissues when Lila finally let go of Travion's hand. Something in her eyes had changed. Gone was the quiet restraint that usually marked her presence. In its place, a fire simmered behind her composed expression, not chaotic or loud, but controlled and calculated. As Travion leaned into her side, defeated but no longer alone, Lila's mind was already building the next step like a chessboard. There would be no pleading, no requests for understanding, no soft, forgiving words. She was done asking people in power to see what they refused to acknowledge. Now she would make them. 2 hours later, Lila found herself seated across from the man she had only heard about through reputation. Mr. Edward Langston. The meeting, hastily arranged by a nervous assistant principal who kept glancing at the door, was meant to clear the air. But Lila didn't come for air. She came for truth. And she knew the truth never arrived without resistance. Langston sat comfortably behind his desk. Posture perfect, sleeves rolled neatly to his elbows like a man preparing to offer help, not harm. His office was meticulously organized, degrees on the wall, a shelf of neatly stacked history books, an American flag angled just so in the corner. But what struck Lila most was the photograph behind him. A picture of him shaking hands with the superintendent, both grinning, both white, both symbols of the kind of authority that claimed to be neutral, but was always selective in its judgment. He welcomed her with a smile too wide, the kind that tried to erase the tension with performative warmth. She returned no smile, no pleasantries. Instead, she sat, adjusted her cane beside her chair, and waited. Langston began speaking in practiced, polished tones, the kind of voice used in PTA meetings and school board press conferences. He acknowledged there had been a misunderstanding during class, that he hadn't intended for Travion to feel embarrassed, and that perhaps his words could have been better chosen. He spoke of fairness, of holding all students to the same high expectations, and then emphasized how important it was for students to develop thick skin in academic settings. Lila didn't interrupt. She let the words stack, one on top of another, until the weight of their hollowness was impossible to ignore. Then, she asked the one question that shifted the temperature of the room. Would you have questioned Travion's essay if he were white? The silence that followed wasn't long, but it stretched enough to show hesitation. Langston blinked, cleared his throat, and said he didn't see color when grading, that he judged content, not students, that he believed in merit. But Lila had heard it all before. The passive denial, the polished deflection. He didn't need to scream slurs or deny entrance to prove his prejudice. His bias lived in the disbelief he wore when black children excelled, in the assumptions he never examined, in the way he weaponized standards to protect his comfort and punish their brilliance. She pressed further. She asked about patterns. Why had 3 black boys from the same class been written up for attitude in the last 2 months, while white students who cursed or disrupted lessons faced no consequence? Why had the advanced reading list not included a single author of color until a parent complained last year? Why were black students consistently underrepresented in his praise, but overrepresented in his discipline? Langston's expression tightened, just slightly, the corners of his mouth pulling inward. He insisted again that race had nothing to do with it, that perhaps those students needed more structure, that if anything he was giving them extra attention, helping them meet expectations. His voice was smooth, unwavering, like a man reciting lines he'd practiced long ago, convinced that neutrality was the same as justice. But the more he spoke, the clearer it became. Langston didn't see himself as biased, and that was the danger. The harm wasn't in overt hatred. It was in subtle erosion, in the way he doubted their minds but trusted their punishment, in how he could humiliate a child publicly, then sleep peacefully at night, convinced he was fair. Lila listened, not because she needed answers, but because she needed to know just how deep his denial ran. And by the end of the conversation, she had no doubt this was not a man who would change. Not because he couldn't, but because he believed he was already right. She rose slowly from her chair, offering no hand, no smile, no promise to follow up. As she turned to leave, her eyes landed on a framed certificate near the door. Teacher of the Year, awarded by the district just last spring. It almost made her laugh, except it wasn't funny. It was tragic. The unexpected twist came when she stepped into the hallway. Just outside the door, a young black girl, maybe 7th or 8th grade, stood nervously holding a notebook. She glanced at Lila, then at the closed door, then back again. Her posture said everything. Uncertainty, fear, hesitation. Lila paused. "Waiting to see Mr. Langston?" she asked gently. The girl nodded. "He told me to rewrite my essay. Said it wasn't what he expected." Lila's stomach twisted. Different child. Same story. Same unspoken message. Shrink yourself. Soften your brilliance. Make it easier to believe you belong. But Lila didn't say that. Instead, she told the girl something else. Something that didn't need to be loud to be powerful. She told her to keep her original essay, to save it somewhere safe, and to remember that not everyone who smiles is on your side. As she walked back to her car, Lila's hands trembled, not with weakness, but with the weight of knowing this wasn't isolated. This wasn't one teacher, or one moment. It was a system wearing clean clothes, pretending its hands weren't dirty. That night, she returned home and pulled open the old wooden chest at the foot of her bed. Inside were the few keepsakes she'd allowed herself to keep from her childhood. Among them was a black and white photo, creased and faded, of a classroom in Louisiana. Her 8th grade teacher stood at the front, holding up her report, laughing. The caption someone had scribbled in the corner read, "Copied from encyclopedia." Lila hadn't looked at the photo in years. It had always been too painful, but now it felt like a map, not just of the past but of what came next. She placed the photo on the table beside her phone, then opened her notes app and began typing. Not a complaint. Not a plea. A plan. Because this time, unlike when she was 13, she had a tool her teacher didn't proof. This time she didn't have to rely on memory, or hope someone believed her. This time she had a camera, and the next morning, when she walked back into Milton Middle and quietly took a seat in the back of classroom 2C, no one noticed the phone in her lap, recording everything. What she captured in just 12 minutes would change everything. Night fell with a slow, uneasy stillness across Dalton. The kind of quiet that didn't calm the soul. It stirred it. In Lila Jackson's living room, the only light came from a flickering lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the walls where photos of Trevion hung between aging portraits of ancestors who had survived far worse and even crueler times. But tonight, Lila's hands weren't busy with tea or prayer. They trembled softly as they unfolded something she hadn't touched in decades. An old, creased black and white photo pulled from a shoebox buried at the back of her closet. The image was frozen in time. A white classroom in 1968. A teacher mid-laugh, holding up a young girl's report like it was a joke. That girl, Lila herself at just 13, sat in the front row, her back stiff, her face hollow. The chalkboard behind them bore the words, "Civil Rights, Then and Now." It had been her proudest paper, and it was turned into a public shame. She had poured her soul into it, pulled stories from her own family history, weaved pain with research, and dared to be honest. But the moment her teacher accused her of copying from the encyclopedia, the class laughed. No one asked for proof. No one defended her. It didn't matter that the writing was original. What mattered was that it was hers. And in that room, a black girl didn't get to be that smart. For years she'd buried the photo. Not out of fear, but because there had never been a way to make it right. Until now, with a breath sharp enough to split glass, Lila picked up her smartphone from the table. It wasn't new, an old model, screen chipped at the edges. But it worked. She opened the camera app and turned it toward herself for a moment, studying her face. Age had carved deep lines around her eyes, but they weren't tired. They were trained. She wasn't going to fight the past. She was going to trap the present. The next morning came with a gray sky, a slight drizzle, and a silence in the car that felt like ceremony. Lila parked a block away from the school, not to sneak in, but because she wanted the walk. She wanted every step toward Milton Middle to feel like a reclaiming of something taken long ago. She dressed in the same cardigan she had worn the day she first stepped into the school office. Intentional, quiet, defiant. This time, no appointment, no explanation, just purpose. Inside the school she moved through the halls with slow precision, unnoticed by most, but not unseen. The security guard gave her a glance but didn't stop her. The receptionist opened her mouth as Lila passed the front office but said nothing. Authority often hesitates in the presence of someone who carries herself like she belongs. And Lila didn't just belong. She was inevitable. By the time she reached classroom 2C, The bell was minutes from ringing. She slipped into the back of the room and took a seat in the corner, a quiet observer. Mr. Langston looked up briefly, caught her eyes, and smiled, a stiff artificial twitch of the lips. Lila nodded back, expression unreadable. No need to start a fire, not yet. The flame would come on its own. Her phone was in her lap, camera already rolling. Students began to trickle in, laughter echoing in the halls before being swallowed by the sterile stillness of the classroom. Travian walked in with his head down, shoulders hunched like someone trying to fold themselves into invisibility. He took his usual seat, third desk from the front, and didn't look up once. Langston greeted the class with that same rehearsed enthusiasm, like a morning talk show host. He spoke of continuing the essay discussions from last week, and handed back the remaining graded papers. His tone shifted as he reached Travian's desk. He paused, dramatically, holding the paper aloft. "This," he said to the class, "is what we'll use as today's discussion piece." Lila didn't move. The phone caught every word. Mr. Langston began reading the essay aloud. It was Travian's work, but under Langston's voice, it was disfigured. He mocked certain phrases, with exaggerated emphasis. "The erasure of black agency in American history," he read with a chuckle. "Now that's some strong vocabulary for a 7th grader." A few students laughed uneasily. Travian stared down at his desk, hands clenched so tightly the veins stood out. Then came the insinuation, subtle, coded, devastating. Langston turned to the class and asked, "Do you think this level of writing could come from any one of you? And if so, would you believe it came without help?" Silence. Lila's grip on the phone tightened. Not a word from her. She wanted it all on camera. Every microaggression, every drop of poison, dressed as policy. The teacher pressed further. "Sometimes," he said with faux sincerity, "students access resources that aren't appropriate. Let's talk about that." Travian finally raised his head, face pale, eyes wide with disbelief. He wasn't just being questioned, he was being dismantled. A student near the back mumbled something. Another stifled a laugh. Langston continued, circling around Travian's desk, pretending to engage the class in open dialogue while weaponizing every sentence like a dagger. And through it all, the camera recorded. 12 minutes. That's all it took. 12 minutes to expose what months of complaints and emails and denials had hidden behind polished words and smiling photos. But what Langston didn't know, and what would make this moment irreversible, was that Lila wasn't just filming for herself. The phone had been synced to a cloud folder, shared with a private email, one that belonged to an old friend of hers, a friend who had once marched in Selma and now held a quiet position in the Department of Education's Civil Rights Division. The upload was automatic. No matter what happened to the phone, the footage was safe. The bell rang, jarring the room back to routine. Students filed out, unaware of what had just occurred. Langston approached Lila, polite smile fixed in place. "Mrs. Jackson," he began, "was there something I can help you with?" She stood slowly, slipped the phone into her pocket, and met his gaze without blinking. "No," she said softly, "but I can help you see yourself." Then she turned and walked out. What she left behind wasn't just discomfort, it was evidence, and she knew what to do with it. Because by the time Langston poured himself coffee in the teacher's lounge, an hour later, the video had already begun spreading across 3 group chats, 1 school parent forum, and most damningly, an anonymous tip submission to the local news station. By mid-afternoon, the world inside and outside Milton Middle had shifted. The video, taken quietly by Lila, erupted online, like gasoline on dry leaves. It didn't creep out slowly, it burned. On social media platforms, the clip circulated within hours, first shared by concerned parents in a private group, then retweeted by former students and activists, and within a few hours tagged with "Shand with Travian" and Milton Middle, exposed. The laughter echoing in Langston's classroom, the mocking inflection he used while reading Travian's essay, the subtle shake of his head at a kid like that. Everything was there, raw and undeniable. Lila watched from her kitchen table as notifications cascaded. Shares, retweets, comments, messages from strangers offering prayers, others demanding justice. A wave of solidarity poured in from people across her state, some from cities she had never heard of. Travian's vulnerable face, drained of dignity but still holding a quiet bravery, appeared on screens everywhere. People who had never met him were calling him brave, gifted, courageous, refusing to let the teacher's version stand unchallenged. Meanwhile, in the small town, whispers turned into heated living room debates. Neighbors texted neighbors. Parents argued behind closed doors. Some parents defended Mr. Langston, insisting that he was a tough but fair teacher, saying maybe Travian had been too sensitive. Others were horrified, remembering their own children, or imagining their children in Travian's seat. At the local grocery store, a woman nearly dropped the produce she was holding when she saw Lila's face on her phone. The same grandmother people knew from Sunday service, now standing up for something they'd all witnessed but ignored. Local community groups began organizing. A small rally was called at the entrance of Milton Middle for the next morning. Flyers were passed out. Hashtags spread beyond social media and onto handwritten signs. We stand with Travian. Stop the doubt. Start the respect. Some older alumni chimed in, posting their own stories of subtle slights, unseen bias, the casual disbelief they faced when they spoke too well, too loud, too smart. The pattern was no longer invisible. It was undeniable. At the same time, mainstream media caught wind. By twilight, a local news station had drafted a short segment, "Controversy at Milton Middle, Allegations of Racism After Viral Classroom Video." A reporter had reached out to the district for comment, and Lila stayed up half the night watching live broadcasts across different channels. Her chest felt tight, not from fear, but anticipation. She knew once the story went public, the real fight would begin. Within the district offices, panic set in. Emails flew. Phone lines buzzed non-stop. Administrators scrambled, not to offer support, but to control the narrative. A hastily drafted statement appeared on the district website, "Milton Middle School, and its faculty uphold the highest standards of fairness and academic integrity." A second statement followed. "While we take these allegations seriously, we encourage parents and community members to await the full review process." School board members were contacted, lawyers were consulted, public relations professionals were called in. They were trying to build a wall of procedure and calm, but they were already too late. The fire had spread beyond containment. Travian's world shifted overnight. Where before hallways echoed with mocking whispers, now there were hesitant glances of support. A couple of classmates who had looked away during class dared to mutter a quiet apology when they saw him at his locker. Others avoided him, unsure what loyalty now meant. But in the lunchroom, a small group of students sat with him, 3 friends, 2 girls and a boy, all quietly supportive, offering water, leaning close so their lips wouldn't carry the word sorry. They didn't preach or demand anything. They just sat. They acknowledged his pain by being there. Behind the screens, parents debated whether to trust the district or the tape. Some called board members demanding immediate dismissal of the teacher. Others warned of a witch hunt. In coffee shops and barber shops, heated voices spoke of bias, reverse racism, false accusations. But for once the voices condemning injustice were loud enough to drown them out. With each passing hour, more evidence surfaced. A former student posted a message on an alumni forum, claiming that she too had experienced dismissal from the same teacher when she had gotten an A on a paper too good to be real. Another posted her mother's complaint letter from 2009, yarded in a metaphorical desk drawer. Names piled up, patterns emerged, a quiet archive of suppressed brilliance. Lila watched it all happen from her living room. The lamp flickering again, shadows dancing across the walls, as if haunted by the ghosts of all the children who had been laughed down before Travian. She didn't celebrate. She steeled herself. She understood now that the goal wasn't vengeance. It was clarity. It was truth. And for the first time, the truth had witnesses. By the next morning, the school district attempted damage control. A brief email to parents went out at 7:03 a.m. Before the school day began, it described the video as a classroom recording taken without explicit permission, and reminded parents of their right to privacy. School officials suggested the matter would be reviewed internally. They invited the community to trust the process. But the response from the public was swift and unforgiving. The comments on the email thread exploded. Parents forwarded the email to news outlets. Local community leaders wrote letters, signed by dozens, demanding transparency. One parent quoted statistics showing disproportionate discipline rates for Black students, numbers the district couldn't easily explain away. Even members of the school's own staff began shifting allegiances. A few teachers, previously silent, sent anonymous voice messages urging administrators to act. One counselor, whose name Lila had never known, texted her a simple message, "Thank you for doing this. We saw it too." At school, when the morning bell rang, there was a silent tension, as though the building itself was waiting. Students moved through the halls in subdued groups. Teachers avoided eye contact with reporters who waited near the entrance. And through it all, Lila walked in again. This time not to observe, but to witness what unraveled. Her cane tapped on tile faintly, announcing presence without apology. Parents gathered outside the schoolyard by 9 o'clock, holding signs and lining the sidewalk. Some held cameras, others just watched. Reporters from the local news station paced, clipboards in hand, microphones ready. A helicopter hovered overhead, its wop-wop beating like the pulse of impending reckoning. The community, which had once accepted silent injustice as normal, now stood in raw daylight demanding truth. Then came the district's announcement. School would be closed for 2 days, pending investigation. The statement read, all staff would undergo sensitivity training. Classes would resume only after all concerns are properly addressed. The email described it as a precautionary measure to ensure a safe and respectful environment for all students. Shock rippled through parents and students alike. Some parents cheered, believing it a first sign of accountability. Others were furious, calling it an overreaction, a publicity stunt, a disruption to their children's routine. Teachers felt cornered. Students felt unsettled. And among all of them, Travian sat silent at home, headphones on, staring out the window, as though waiting for a verdict he didn't quite believe could come. Lila watched him from the doorway. She didn't speak, she just waited. In the quiet house, the shadows seemed longer than before. The fractured innocence of that morning felt tangible. Too many lives had been wounded by too many dismissals, too many too good to be real essays, too many unspoken biases. And still, despite the outrage, something in Lila's bones told her this wasn't enough. The district's announcement, in her gut, smelled like compromise, like a promise wrapped in caution, a bandage on a deep cut. Because just when public sympathy seemed to side with Travian, and many believed justice might finally arrive, the school district released a second statement. They announced that the video, they claimed, had been edited and manipulated, and declared the investigation closed with no disciplinary action. The email hit inboxes at 7:46 a.m. It arrived without warning, wrapped in institutional politeness, signed off by the assistant superintendent with careful phrasing and a neutral tone. Effective immediately, it began, student Travian Jackson has been placed on temporary suspension pending further investigation into his conduct during classroom instruction. There was no mention of racism, no acknowledgement of the viral video, no reference to the nationwide outrage boiling over social media. Just the word disruptive, vague and damning, used like a scalpel meant to sever a boy from his dignity without leaving a traceable wound. Lila read the email twice, then 3 more times, as if repetition might change the meaning. Her fingers, gnarled from time and habit, tightened around the phone until her knuckles paled. Across from her, Travian sat stunned, staring blankly at the breakfast table, a spoon resting untouched in his cereal. He hadn't spoken yet. The silence was thicker than grief. This wasn't punishment, it was erasure. The school had chosen not to investigate the teacher, but the boy. News traveled fast. Before the second bell rang at Milton Middle, parents had already begun texting each other. Social media was in chaos. Threads of outrage, disbelief, sorrow. Screenshots of the suspension letter were reposted over and over, followed by commentary that cut like blades. This is retaliation. They're protecting the teacher, not the child. How do you suspend the victim? The district refused interviews. When pressed, their spokesperson simply stated that all students were subject to school policies and that Travian's behavior was under review. They framed the issue as a matter of order, not race, hiding behind bureaucratic language and legal ambiguity. The real message was louder than anything said: challenge the system, and you will pay for it. Within hours, the front steps of Milton Middle were no longer just concrete. They became a stage. Parents, students, and neighbors gathered beneath gray skies, holding signs scrawled in sharp marker. Some read, "Justice for Travian." Others repeated Lila's own words. Same pain, new generation. The protest wasn't loud at first. It didn't need to be. It carried the quiet weight of knowing you've been betrayed by the very place that promised to educate and protect. Lila stood front and center. Not yelling, not pleading, just present, unwavering. She held a sign too, but hers wasn't store-bought. It was hand-painted, bold red letters on white cardboard, and it said what she refused to let them ignore: suspending silence. News trucks returned, this time with better cameras and bigger questions. The story had evolved. What began as a classroom incident had become a district-wide crisis. Anchors leaned into phrases like racial reckoning, institutional bias, and systemic cover-up. Every angle was dissected, except the one the district refused to face: why a black boy's voice was too dangerous to be heard. Inside the school, administrators held emergency meetings. Staff were instructed not to speak publicly. Teachers were warned to remain neutral. The principal, who had been evasive since the video's release, stopped responding to emails altogether. And Mr. Langston? He remained in his classroom, untouched and unbothered, continuing his lessons while Trevion's desk sat empty. But what the district didn't expect, what they had never prepared for, was how quickly silence could backfire. 3 days into Trevion's suspension, a town hall meeting was called at the local recreation center. What began as a space for community dialogue quickly unraveled into chaos. Lines wrapped around the building. Residents from every side of the county showed up. Black parents told stories of their children's brilliance being doubted. White parents demanded accountability or offered tepid defenses of a good teacher being targeted. The microphone passed from hand to hand, and so did the pain. One father, who hadn't spoken publicly before, stepped up trembling. His son, he revealed, had been in Langston's class 2 years earlier, and had also been accused of plagiarism after turning in an essay about Malcolm X. The essay had never been returned. The accusation had never been proven, but his son had never written another paper again. The room shifted. Gasps gave way to murmurs. It wasn't one boy. It wasn't one moment. It was a pattern, long, calculated, and deeply embedded. Still, the district held the line. They issued no retraction, no apology, no suspension for Langston. Instead, they doubled down, releasing a second statement, claiming the viral footage had been taken out of context, and warning that misinformation poses harm to the educational process. It was the same deflection playbook: discredit the narrative, silence the victims, protect the power. But this time, the machine wasn't working. Because just as the district thought they could regain control, a crack appeared in their carefully managed facade. An unexpected ally stepped forward, and she was nothing like Lila. Her name was Adriana Parks, a 32-year-old white assistant teacher who had quietly worked alongside Mr. Langston for 4 years. Until now, she had remained invisible, present at school functions, cordial at faculty meetings, neutral in staff rooms. But something in her snapped the day Trevian was suspended. She saw her own silence for what it was: complicity. That morning, she walked into the superintendent's office unannounced. She dropped a folder on his desk: 33 pages of internal emails, documented complaints, disciplinary discrepancies, and student evaluations. Patterns of racial bias, ignored warnings, red flags no one acted on. She had saved them. Every one. Then she handed in her resignation. But Adriana didn't stop there. By noon, she stood outside the school building, reporters swarming, microphone wires snaking between her feet. Her voice was steady, not rehearsed, not angry, just raw. She spoke of what she had witnessed. The tone Mr. Langston used only with black boys. The way he spoke about attitude like it was a disease. The constant disbelief in their capabilities. The side comments she once laughed off to avoid confrontation. She admitted her silence, her fear, and then her decision to choose truth over job security. Her words hit harder than the video. Because she wasn't a stranger. She was part of the system, and she was naming it from the inside. Back at Lila's house, Trevian watched the live stream unfold, the light from the screen reflecting off his face like fire. For the first time since the suspension, his eyes didn't look empty. They looked awake. Lila didn't say a word. She simply reached over and placed her hand over his. It was enough. But as evening fell, and protests began again outside the district building, another wave of panic struck the administration. Because hidden in Adriana's resignation folder was something they hadn't expected: a memo, dated 7 months ago, signed by the principal himself, acknowledging a parent's formal complaint about Langston's pattern of racial bias and choosing to handle the matter internally. The name of the parent had been redacted, but Lila recognized the handwriting. It was hers. Because buried in the school's own archives was proof that they had known about Langston long before Trevian, and now that proof was no longer hidden. The air in Dalton had shifted. No longer heavy with denial, it now trembled with a sharp charge, the kind that lingered before a storm. In classrooms, break rooms, even church pews, whispers about Adriana Parks moved like electricity. Parents asked each other if it was true. Teachers passed glances but avoided words. Students caught snippets on their phones. The assistant teacher, with the gentle eyes, the one who used to sit silently beside Mr. Langston, had just detonated a truth bomb no one saw coming, and it was still erupting. Adriana's resignation wasn't just a formality. It was a declaration of war on a system she had once enabled by staying quiet. She wasn't dramatic, and she didn't deliver her truth like a martyr. She came with evidence, not emotion. But that evidence screamed louder than any chant outside the school gates. Her press statement, simple and unscripted, had been filmed on a borrowed mic in front of the school's faded brick wall. But what she said couldn't have been clearer. She spoke about watching patterns unfold year after year. How Mr. Langston consistently gave harsher feedback to essays written by black boys. How he'd refer to their ideas as far-fetched or ambitious, while praising similar work from white students as innovative or insightful. She talked about the faculty meetings where complaints were brushed aside, where the phrase "he's old school" was used to excuse what was at its core systemic targeting. Adriana admitted her own complicity, her own silence. For years she told herself that staying neutral was the safest way to survive. A new teacher in a small town, afraid to speak against someone with tenure and charm. But watching Trevian, she said, broke something open in her. She had seen that same look before, not just in his eyes, but in the quiet way other black boys had stopped raising their hands, stopped submitting essays, stopped showing up like themselves. She couldn't unsee it now. What stunned people more than her words were the documents she shared. Not accusations, receipts, folders of internal emails where black parents raised concerns, were met with condescension or silence. Referral patterns showing how discipline was disproportionately aimed at students of color, even for the same infractions. One spreadsheet revealed a 4-year trend. In Mr. Langston's class alone, 71% of all disciplinary write-ups were for black boys, who made up less than 20% of the student population. Then came the bombshell, an email dated April of the same year, sent by Adriana to the principal. It flagged Mr. Langston's comments during an essay review session. In the email she wrote, he joked that a student's grammar was surprisingly articulate, and then implied the student must have had help. That student, Adriana now confirmed, was not Trevian. It was a different black boy, and his essay had also vanished from school records. Local journalists scrambled to piece it all together. The superintendent's office refused to comment. School board members went silent. Even Mr. Langston, previously smug in the face of criticism, stopped showing up to work, citing medical leave. His classroom sat dark for the first time in years. But Adriana wasn't done. 3 days after her resignation, she joined a live stream with a national education equity group. She didn't cry or dramatize her story. She spoke as someone who had once believed in the myth of meritocracy, who had wanted to believe schools were fair and colorblind. Now, she understood that silence wasn't neutrality. It was compliance. She revealed one more twist during that stream. She had once recommended Trevian's essay to Mr. Langston for a regional writing competition. She had read it before it was turned in. She knew it was original. But after Mr. Langston reviewed it, he never submitted it. Never told Trevian. Just shelved it, like it never existed. That revelation sent another wave across the community. It wasn't just mockery or bias anymore. It was theft, erasure, a deliberate act to keep a child from being recognized. One that Adriana had silently watched and now couldn't forgive herself for. Support poured in for her from across the country. Teachers, students, alumni, and activists praising her courage. But inside Dalton, where loyalties ran deep and grudges ran deeper, something darker stirred. That Friday night, just after 11 p.m., Adriana returned from a late dinner with her sister. Her street was quiet, the kind of neighborhood where porch lights stayed on out of habit, not fear. She parked her car in the driveway, got out with takeout leftovers in hand, and noticed something odd, the faint shimmer of broken glass near the passenger door. She stepped closer. Her stomach dropped. The driver's side window had been smashed inward. Her tires slashed, not one, but all 4. But it wasn't the vandalism that made her knees wobble. It was what lay on the windshield, a printout of her resignation letter, stained with something red, and scribbled in black ink across the top were the words, "Rats get removed." She dropped the food. The police arrived quickly. Too quickly, she thought, considering their usual pace. They asked the usual questions, dusted for prints, took photos. But their tone lacked urgency. One officer remarked, it might have been a random act. Another said she probably stirred up some drama. Adriana stared at them blankly, the word probably cutting sharper than any threat. Even now, surrounded by evidence, her truth was still a matter of opinion. That night, she didn't sleep. Her phone buzzed nonstop. Friends, reporters, lawyers, some offering protection, others asking for comment. But she ignored them all, sitting in the dim kitchen, staring at the resignation letter she had printed weeks ago, now torn, stained, and weaponized. The next morning, Lila came to see her. They hadn't met in person before, only exchanged messages online after the press conference. But when Adriana opened the door and saw Lila standing there, she didn't need words. Lila didn't offer pity. She offered presence. She stepped inside, set down a bag of food, and sat quietly across from her. In that silence, Adriana broke. She confessed the guilt, the fear, the shame. She admitted how long she'd known something was wrong, and said nothing. She spoke about her father, a preacher who always taught her to tell the truth, and how she thought doing it now would bring peace. But it hadn't. It had made her a target. Lila listened, nodded, and when the moment was right, she finally spoke. She told Adriana that courage never arrives clean. It comes bloodied, tired, and late, but it still shows up, and that's what mattered. But just as Adriana began to exhale, to feel a flicker of relief in the presence of someone who understood, her phone lit up again. This time, it wasn't a reporter or a lawyer. It was a number she didn't recognize. One line, one sentence. Check the school board minutes from February, and follow the money. Because Adriana's whistle wasn't the only sound being silenced, and what she'd just uncovered would lead to a corruption trail much darker than a single teacher's bias. The rain hit Dalton like an omen, thin, cold, and constant. It dripped down porch railings, puddled beneath protest signs, and streaked across windshields that had become bulletin boards for hate. Adriana Parks woke to silence that morning, the kind that pretends to be peace but is really just a warning. Her car was gone now, towed days earlier, after the brick shattered the windshield and the slashed tires gave up their fight. But the damage remained, lingering in the air, in her gait, in her breath. She looked out her window, eyes flicking to the mailbox before forcing herself to check it. Another envelope, no return address. Inside, a piece of paper, blank except for a single typed sentence. "You're not from here. Leave." Across town, Lila found something similar. A yellowing envelope, slid under her door sometime before dawn. The handwriting was shaky, almost theatrical. "You want attention? You got it. Next time, it'll be more than words." It wasn't just a threat. It was a reminder that even after all this noise, there were still people willing to crawl out of comfort to protect silence. But neither Lila nor Adriana flinched. If anything, the threats only clarified the stakes. The more resistance they faced, the more they knew the truth was pushing on the right nerve. Lila didn't wait for another letter. That afternoon, she stood on the courthouse steps in a long, dark coat, her cane anchored beside her, her voice ringing out, not in rage but in resolve. Cameras clicked, microphones tilted toward her face. She didn't read from a script. She didn't hold notes. She spoke from memory and fire. She told them this wasn't about a video anymore. It wasn't about one teacher, or one essay, or even one boy. It was about a pattern, about a town that had built its education system on the illusion of equality, about black children whose brilliance had been treated like a mistake to be corrected instead of a truth to be uplifted. "If the school won't teach these children," she said slowly, letting the words slice the cold air, "then we will teach the school." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was stunned. Even the media, trained for soundbites, paused before asking follow-ups. The crowd that had gathered, parents, former students, community leaders, stood still, heads nodding, fists clenching, signs tighter. Behind Lila, Trevian stood quietly, taller somehow. Not because the pain had faded, but because he saw now that the world had noticed. The press conference was broadcast that night across 3 networks. Local news led with it. Even national outlets picked up the clip. Lila became the unexpected symbol of a fight long ignored. Her words flooded timelines. Clips circulated. Commentators debated. And then came the wave no one had anticipated. Former students from Milton Middle, some now adults, began posting their own stories. Tweets, Facebook posts, even recorded interviews, some from years ago, some as recent as last semester. They spoke of subtle humiliations, of being held back from honors programs, of being told they were too street or not ready. One story from 2011 described a gifted student being moved out of advanced math after outperforming white peers, moved without explanation. Another from 2016 detailed a black girl being marked down for attitude during presentations, though her white counterparts spoke with the same conviction. What had once been dismissed as isolated incidents now formed a tapestry of injustice. Lila knew this momentum couldn't be wasted. She had already begun consulting with legal aid, civil rights lawyers from Atlanta who'd been watching the case unfold. Together they drafted formal papers. Not just for Travian, but a class action suit that could name the district as a whole. The documents were thick, each page heavy with testimony, data, and evidence. But just as they were preparing to file, a quiet twist fell into Lila's lap, and it changed everything. It started with a simple question. Adriana, still shaken, but undeterred, had been combing through past school board minutes, as the strange message from the anonymous caller had instructed. At first there was nothing unusual. Budget approvals, policy reviews, standard administrative banter. But then, buried in a February transcript, she spotted a line that didn't fit. Board member approval for real allocation of discretionary staff bonuses. A nondescript phrase, tucked between routine expenditures. Attached was a line item, a $12,000 bonus to a Mr. Edward Langston, listed not as a teaching award, but as consultant fee policy development. The title raised a red flag. Mr. Langston was a full-time teacher, not a policy consultant. No other staff members had received similar payments that year. Adriana brought the file to Lila, who read it 3 times, her jaw tightening with each pass. The next day, Lila's nephew, a quiet researcher with a knack for tracing names through databases, dug deeper. What he found peeled back the last layer of the district's protective skin. Mr. Langston wasn't just a veteran teacher. He was also the godson of Superintendent Harold Kern. Photos surfaced, old banquet snapshots, a family barbecue from years earlier. Even a campaign event where Kern had introduced Langston as practically my own blood. The two families were deeply connected. Langston had been quietly advising the district on disciplinary policy for nearly a decade. The same policies that disproportionately punished black students. The same policies that were used to justify Trevian's suspension. The revelation detonated like a bomb. Now it wasn't just racism, it was nepotism, corruption, cover-up. Within hours of the discovery, a reporter from a major investigative outlet published a breaking story. Superintendent's ties to accused teacher raise questions of systemic bias. It was relentless, detailed, unignorable. Parents who once sat on the fence suddenly found their balance tipping. Even those who had defended Langston could no longer ignore the tangled web of favoritism and silence. School board meetings turned into war zones. Protesters doubled. Signs changed. No longer just justice for Travian, but now clean the board, fire Kern, protect our children. Inside her home, Lila placed the lawsuit file on the table and added one more sheet. A printed photo of Kern and Langston smiling together at a scholarship dinner. She didn't need a caption, because now that the school district's loyalty had been exposed, not to students but to itself, the fight wasn't just local anymore. A federal civil rights investigation had quietly opened, and it had already reached out to Lila. The revelation about Superintendent Harold Kern didn't just shift the ground beneath Dalton. It cracked it open. What Adriana uncovered had been the spark, but now the fire roared everywhere. In living rooms, on talk radio, in group chats. In the quiet spaces where people realized the problem wasn't one teacher's cruelty but an entire system built to protect him. By the time the investigative article circulated across the county, the truth could no longer be treated as rumor or exaggeration. Kern and Langston were not simply colleagues. They were fraternity brothers, college roommates, and decades-long confidants, whose careers had risen in parallel, one behind a desk, the other behind a podium. It was a relationship steeped in favoritism, sealed with unspoken agreements, and paid for by students who never stood a chance. The documents leaked were staggering. One report, dated years earlier, revealed a parent complaint accusing Langston of undermining black students' academic confidence. It had been highlighted in yellow and forwarded directly to Kern. His response, written in a single dismissive line, read, "Handled." Another document showed that when a black teacher, Miss Rosa Kent, applied for a leadership role in curriculum development, the committee unanimously supported her, yet Kern quietly awarded the position to a junior white teacher with less than 2 years of experience. The file bore no explanation, only Kern's initial. The most devastating discovery came from an HR log that tracked removals and non-renewals of teachers over the past 12 years. The pattern was unmistakable. Black educators were dismissed at quadruple the rate of their white counterparts, despite performance reviews that consistently marked them as exceeds expectation. As community members pieced these patterns together, a picture emerged of a district rotting from the top down, one that claimed to champion diversity while quietly dismantling it behind closed doors. The betrayal ran deep. Parents who once trusted the district felt foolish. Teachers, who suspected the truth but feared retaliation, now found themselves questioning their own years of silence. Even students sensed the weight of something bigger than their town, something structural and historical. Lila watched it all unfold from her dining table, surrounded by stacks of documents, news clippings, and handwritten notes. She wasn't overwhelmed, she was anchored. Every detail brought her closer to understanding exactly how Trevian had become a target. Kern had shaped a system where Langston's bias wasn't just tolerated, it was rewarded. Teachers learned quickly which students were worth investing in, and which could be restrained, doubted, or sidelined without consequence. This wasn't incompetence, it was design. The lawsuit forming in the community grew faster than anyone anticipated. Lawyers from Atlanta and Chicago reached out, offering support. Civil rights groups requested statements. Local parents gathered nightly at the recreation center, sharing stories they had once dismissed as isolated frustrations. Now they could see the architecture of discrimination that had shaped their children's experience. Those who previously insisted race has nothing to do with it fell silent, confronted with evidence too stark to ignore. And yet, even as legal gears began to turn, a heavy question lingered in the back of every meeting. What about the children who had already been harmed? What about the kids whose brilliance had been dimmed, whose confidence had been eroded? What about Trevian, the boy at the center of it all? At home, he was unraveling quietly. The world outside saw him as a symbol, a rallying point, a face of necessary change. But inside his own skin, he felt like a fracture deepening with every day he stayed suspended. He didn't go outside much. He didn't eat unless told. The light in his room stayed off for hours, sometimes the entire day. When Lila tried to speak to him, his answers came broken, thin, like pieces of a thought that never fully formed. One evening, after a long day of meetings and calls, Lila found him sitting on the edge of his bed, staring at his laptop with a hollow expression. She sat beside him carefully. His shoulders jerked when she touched him, startled, not because of her, but because of something he had seen. He turned the screen toward her. It was a comment thread under a local news report. Most messages supported him, praising his courage. But buried in the middle was one that made Lila's breath stop. He should be grateful anyone bothered to read his essay. Kids like him don't belong in advanced classes anyway. Kids like him. The phrase that had haunted her as a child now returned with surgical precision. But it wasn't the cruelty of the words that broke her. It was the way Trevian stared at them, absorbing each syllable as if it were confirmation of something he had feared long before the video. When she whispered that the comment meant nothing, he shook his head. It means something to someone, he said softly. Someone who thinks they're right. Someone who thinks I don't deserve what I did. It was the longest sentence he had spoken in days. Lila wanted to argue, to fight the sentence in his mind before it crystallized. But he wasn't looking for correction. He was naming what hurt. That night he didn't sleep. Lila heard him moving in his room. Pacing, stopping, pacing again. Around 3 a.m., he came into the kitchen, sat at the table, and stared at the glass of water she set in front of him. When she asked what he needed, he whispered a truth that shattered her. I don't feel smart anymore. The words were barely audible. They weren't loud, but they were decisive, final, like a door closing quietly in a house already too dark. Lila reached for him, held him, tried to rebuild what had been broken. She told him he wasn't defined by one teacher, one school, or one system designed to misread him. But each sentence seemed to fall around him, instead of into him. She could feel him drifting, detaching from the belief in himself that she had spent years nurturing. By dawn she realized something terrifying. The lawsuit might hold the district accountable, but who would repair the boy who had been wounded at the center of it all? As the legal team assembled, as depositions were scheduled, as more past students stepped forward, as the superintendent scrambled for allies, Trevian faded further. The community wanted victory. Lila wanted healing. But justice that arrives late often feels like an apology, instead of repair. Days later, during a legal strategy meeting, Lila received a text from her neighbor. I think you should come home. He's not doing well. She didn't wait. She left papers scattered across the table, hurried down the courthouse steps, and sped through the streets with her heart pounding, as if trying to outrun the truth. She found Travian in his room, curled up in the corner between his bed and the wall, as if trying to make himself small enough to disappear. His breathing was shallow. His eyes didn't rise when she entered. When she knelt beside him, he whispered, "I don't want them to look at me anymore." That was when Lila felt the full weight of what the district had done. They hadn't just suspended him. They had stripped him of safety, identity, and belonging. They had forced him to carry a burden older than he was, heavier than any child should bear. And as lawsuits gathered momentum, cameras multiplied, and outrage spread across the country, Lila realized that justice was no longer just a victory to fight for, but a race to outrun the damage already inside his heart. Because if the system had broken him this deeply, the next question was the one no one wanted to ask aloud. Even if the community won, would Travian ever recover what had been taken? The noise outside didn't reach Travian anymore. Not the chants echoing from protests down the block. Not the camera shutters snapping outside Milton Middle. Not even the voices on television speaking his name like he was an idea instead of a child. Inside his room, everything was still. Stillness not born from peace, but from retreat. The once curious boy who used to bombard Lila with questions about the Harlem Renaissance and civil rights law, now stared at his ceiling in long stretches of silence. His bookshelf sat untouched, covered in a fine layer of dust. The essay notebooks Lila had once proudly stacked on his dresser, each one full of his original thoughts, his eager handwriting, his dreams on lined paper, had vanished into the closet, stuffed deep behind winter clothes as though the words inside them had turned toxic. Travian no longer wrote. He no longer asked. He no longer laughed. The suspension had ended, technically. But he didn't return to school. Not out of protest, but because his body rebelled at the thought. Each time Lila suggested trying again, just for a few hours, his hands would tremble, or his breath would shorten, or he'd sit frozen at the edge of the bed, as if his muscles had forgotten how to move forward. When he did speak, it was rarely about what had happened in class. It was about how he couldn't trust the looks people gave him now, whether pitying or admiring. Every hallway, every classroom, every desk reminded him that his voice had once been a weapon used against him. Lila tried to protect him the only way she knew how, by holding everything else together. She stayed firm in legal meetings, tireless with media requests, persistent in pressuring the district. But in the quiet moments between it all, she watched him disappear a little more. There were no laws to reverse what he felt when classmates laughed. No policy that could give back the safety he lost when a teacher questioned his intelligence in front of the world. Justice, it seemed, moved slower than harm. At night he tossed in bed, sometimes calling out, not with screams, but with pleading words that fractured Lila's sleep. "I didn't lie," or "I wrote it myself," or worse, "I'll be quieter." One night she found him curled under his desk, arms wrapped around his knees, whispering, "I just want them to stop looking at me like that." It wasn't about being believed anymore. It was about being seen and still feeling invisible. Therapists offered strategies. Advocates suggested homeschooling. Activists called him brave. But bravery doesn't heal a child's internal map when it's been shattered by betrayal. Travian wasn't afraid of being mocked anymore. He was afraid of being misread forever. Lila tried everything. She cooked his favorite meals, brought him new books, even framed the photo of his old essay to remind him of his power. But the light didn't return. One afternoon, she printed out pages from Maya Angelou, hoping his love for poetry might stir something. He didn't even look up. It wasn't defiance. It was disconnection. The weight had settled on his shoulders so early, and so heavy, he no longer believed he could stand again. Then came the nightmares. More vivid, more consistent. Scenes where he was locked in a room, and his teacher held the only key, where every paper he wrote crumbled to ash, where he stood in front of the class trying to explain himself, but no sound came out. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, hands gripping the edge of the bed, the sheets twisted beneath him like storm-tossed fabric. Lila stayed strong in front of him, but in the privacy of the laundry room, she sobbed. She clutched his baby blanket some nights, aching for the days when his biggest fear was missing the ice cream truck. Now he carried fears that belonged to grown men, fear of being disbelieved, dismissed, dismantled. One morning something changed, not in his behavior, but in the way Lila felt. A sharp instinct, a familiar ache in her chest that told her something was coming. She couldn't explain it, just a stillness that wasn't the usual silence. Travian didn't come to the table that day. He didn't answer her knock. Lila pushed open the door and found the room empty. Lights off, bed made, clothes untouched. But on his pillow, there was a single page, torn from a notebook. He had written again, but not for class, not for school. The letter was in his handwriting, but it was different. Each word pressed harder into the paper than the last, as if he had needed the pen to carve the message into something real. It wasn't long, but every line was a wound opened onto the page. He wrote about the feeling of shrinking when someone doubts your mind, about not knowing how to exist in a world where your intelligence is treated like an error, about the sound of classmates laughing, and how it kept replaying in his ears like a broken song he couldn't mute. He wrote that he no longer felt like he belonged anywhere, that home didn't feel safe because it reminded him of what had been taken, and school didn't feel safe because it had done the taking. Then he ended the letter with a line Lila would never forget.
I'm not sad, I'm just tired of trying to be real when they keep deciding I'm not.
She dropped to the bed. Her hand clutched the page like it could bleed. For the first time since the story went public, she felt something more terrifying than rage. She felt helpless. This wasn't just about a suspension anymore. This was about a boy being rewritten by the very people who claimed to be his teachers. That night, Lila sat in Trevian's doorway, watching as he finally slept, his body restless even in dreams. She held the letter like a lifeline, knowing that inside those words was a plea she couldn't ignore. She knew the lawsuit would move forward. She knew the protests would grow. She knew the district would fall, eventually. But none of that would matter if Trevian couldn't return to himself. So she made a decision, one that would change the trajectory of everything. She folded the letter carefully. Then she stood up and walked toward the kitchen table, where her phone waited. She wasn't calling a lawyer. Not this time. She was calling someone else. Someone she had sworn she'd never speak to again. Someone who had left this fight years ago but knew exactly what it meant to lose your voice at school and rebuild it in the face of indifference. Because what Trevian didn't know was that the person on the other end of that call had once been erased too, and now she was ready to return and teach the system what it meant to listen. The morning after Lila made the call, the air inside her house felt different, thicker somehow, like grief and resolve had started mixing into something new. She hadn't slept. Not fully. Every time her eyes closed, she saw Trevian's letter. His words hadn't just pierced her. They had reopened every wound she thought had scarred over decades ago. But beneath the sorrow sat something sharper, a responsibility. The letter was more than a cry for help. It was evident, undeniable, handwritten evidence that a child's spirit had been ground down by a system designed to do exactly that. She read it again at the kitchen table, her hands steady now, not because the pain had faded, but because the direction had become clear. The world needed to see this. Not for attention, not for sympathy, but for the sake of truth, and to remind the community that while they debated policy and contracts and reputations, a child had been unraveling just beneath their feet. She snapped a photo of the letter. The handwriting was clean, careful, and unmistakably young. She posted it alongside a message that didn't plead or argue. It simply stated, "My grandson wrote this last night. This is what happens when brilliance is met with suspicion. When a child is punished for being exceptional while black. If you've been watching this story unfold, know this. It's not a story, it's a child. And he's still breaking." She clicked post and walked away from the screen. The world did not. Within 20 minutes, the tweet had thousands of shares. By the hour mark, civil rights groups had reposted it, along with celebrities, journalists, and teachers who saw their own students in Trevian. The letter was no longer just personal. It had become a mirror, forcing people to confront what education looks like when it fails to love every child equally. By sunset, Read Trevian's letter was trending. Lila's inbox filled with messages she couldn't read fast enough. Former students from across the country wrote to say they had felt the same. Parents sent photos of their own children holding signs that said, "I belong." Teachers posted pledges to change the way they speak about intelligence in their classrooms. College professors offered Trevian mentorship. Authors asked to send him books. Civil rights attorneys flooded her messages, all offering their services pro bono, ready to file every possible suit. And then came the donations. In just 48 hours, a stranger, someone who had followed the case since the video first leaked, launched a GoFundMe titled "Protect Trevian's Future." It began as a modest goal, enough for therapy, maybe private school, maybe legal costs. But the goal was crushed within the day. The fund exploded past 6 figures by the end of the week. Local reporters were no longer the only ones calling. National news anchors requested interviews. Documentarians reached out. Activists wanted to march. Authors wanted to write about it. Suddenly, the scandal at Milton Middle wasn't just Dalton's to carry, it was America's to reckon with. But not everyone celebrated. The school district, already buckling under the weight of lawsuits and exposure, entered full damage control mode. Their initial response was vague, then defensive, and finally insulting. They released a statement that said, "We regret any emotional discomfort this situation may have caused. Not trauma, not injustice, just discomfort, like Trevian had been given the wrong lunch order." The statement only made things worse. Protests resumed, with a renewed fury. What had once been 50 people, with handmade signs, became crowds in the hundreds, many holding up printed copies of the letter, laminated against the wind, taped to their jackets, or held above their heads as shields. The pressure reached a new high when an emergency school board meeting was called. It was live-streamed to accommodate the nationwide interest. The room overflowed with parents, students, and activists. Lila sat in the front row, her presence steady and silent, with Trevian beside her, not because he wanted to be, but because he needed to see that truth didn't always end in isolation. The board stumbled through the agenda. Faces red, voices shaky, eyes darting at every camera. One member attempted to downplay the letter as emotional but incomplete, and the room erupted. A student shouted from the back, "What part of that letter is incomplete? His pain or your ignorance?" And then, mid-meeting, mid-chaos, mid-denial, the room went still. A man in a gray suit whispered something to the board president. She froze, cleared her throat, leaned toward the mic, and delivered a sentence that reset the entire tone of the night. "We've just been informed that the United States Department of Education has opened a preliminary civil rights investigation into the Dalton Unified School District." Gasps, murmurs, cameras shifted, phones flew up. The twist didn't just shake the room. It split it, because while some board members looked stunned, two of them exchanged glances, not surprise but something closer to fear. Lila saw it. She clocked it instantly. There was something more, something they had hoped would never see daylight. Outside, the crowd erupted with chants of "Due Goj," while inside the board tried to regain composure. The federal investigation wasn't symbolic. It meant interviews, subpoenas, audits. Every file, every complaint, every ignored parent email would now be reviewed, not by sympathetic administrators, but by attorneys trained to see through decades of institutional cover-ups. Lila stayed seated, calm, watching it all unfold. She had seen systems resist before, but she had never seen one cornered like this. The next day, the Department of Education confirmed it publicly. The letter had triggered not only a civil rights review, but also a forensic analysis into hiring practices, suspension trends, and curriculum bias. Suddenly, the town of Dalton wasn't just a local headline. It became a national case study. And Trevian, the boy once mocked for being too smart, was now the face of a generation that refused to be silent. But inside his home, he remained fragile. No matter how many headlines his letter created, Trevian didn't return to writing. He watched it all from the shadows, unsure if he was the author or the subject of this story. He feared that the movement had grown too big for him, that his pain had become a banner, that people had taken his truth and turned it into a spectacle. Lila reassured him, reminded him daily that he was more than a headline. But in moments when he was alone, the doubt returned. Still, things were shifting. For the first time in weeks, he asked for paper again. Not to write essays, just to sketch. His hand moved slowly, clumsily, but it moved. Lila didn't comment. She just left stacks of paper by the table each morning. Then came the moment she hadn't expected: an envelope, small and hand-sealed, placed on her pillow. Inside was a new letter, not written for the public, not for school, just for her. In it, Trevian thanked her for not trying to fix everything, for just sitting with him through the quiet, for still believing in his words when he couldn't find them. He ended the letter with a single line: "If they tried to erase me, then writing is how I stay." Lila folded it gently, tears threatening but never falling, because just as the family started to rebuild, a leaked internal email landed in a journalist's inbox, and it revealed that someone high in the district had ordered Trevian's essay to be quietly removed from the state writing competition, long before the scandal ever broke. The doors to the county courthouse swung open early that morning, and a stream of faces, parents, students, alumni, reporters poured into the cavernous marble lobby. The air was thick with expectation, discomfort, and raw anger. News crews stationed tripods beneath the ornate balconies, Lawyers in dark suits moved through the crowd like predators seeking safe corners. For many, this day had been a long time coming. For others, it was the moment when long-buried truths would finally face the light. Inside the main courtroom, every seat was filled. Some spectators stood along the walls. The judge's bench loomed ahead, carved from wood worn by decades of verdicts. On one side sat the district's legal team, polished, calm, practiced. On the other, Lila Jackson, seated beside a resilient white assistant teacher, Adriana Parks. Behind them, 3 former black students, who once bore Mr. Langston's harsh disbelief, and behind them, a small figure barely visible in the crowd, Travian Jackson. The weight of the past days and decades settled in the hushed murmurs. The district attorneys opened with a composed statement, their tone measured, voices calm. They spoke of procedural disputes, unclear documentation, and limited evidentiary value. They painted the case as a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by social media outrage, insisting there was no systemic prejudice, only an isolated academic complaint. Their closing words carried a warning: do not allow emotion and public pressure to replace fact. The silence that followed carried the certainty of a well-rehearsed performance, but in that courtroom, the defense felt brittle already. Then the testimonies began. The first former student, now in college, described a pattern, an essay praised by peers, later dismissed as too ambitious, downgraded, frowned upon, then quietly returned. She described the shame that settled in her bones, the way she began to write smaller, to hide ideas, to shrink words, so they wouldn't stand out. The memory made the air dip. Heads turned sideways, pens paused. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. No emotion, but something darker, recognition. Next came the second student, a boy who had once been eager to debate history, to challenge textbooks. He spoke about lowered grades, silent discouragement, and the sting of being told his work was unlikely from someone like you. He had stopped raising his hand after that. His final admission, soft but firm, echoed in the hush. He had stopped believing in his own mind. A woman near the back wiped away a tear. The judge's face remained unreadable. The silence remained, heavy and hollow. The third former student, a quiet girl with calm composure, offered what the attorneys called hard data. She produced printed grade sheets, timelines, referral records. Each number, each date, each skipped evaluation painted a pattern. Black students receiving harsher comments, fewer opportunities, less encouragement, lines drawn in ink, but the pattern clear enough to bleed through any denial. The courtroom held its breath. The defense shifted uncomfortably, glancing at each other, at the judge, at the ceiling. Then it was Adriana Parks' turn. Already a central figure in the scandal, she rose and presented internal emails, notes, and a spreadsheet showing disproportionate disciplinary referrals. She described in quiet, steady narration how she had once justified her silence to survive. But watching Travian, she said, changed her mind. She had realized something others refused to see, that fairness dressed in paperwork still dripped bias. Her testimony ended not with anger, but sorrow. Sorrow for the children who never spoke, who never had proof, who never believed they were good enough. The room felt colder. The defense attorneys looked older. The judge exhaled slowly. Finally came the moment most had waited for. Trevian stood, hands slightly trembling, shoulders hunched but resolute. He faced the gallery, not just the bench. He began to speak, not with rehearsed words, but with memory. He recalled the laughter, the disbelief, the grinding ache of being told his truth wasn't valid. He described the nightmares, the nights drenched in sweat, the way he stopped seeing himself as a student, but as a problem to be managed. His voice shook only for a moment, then it steadied, not proud, not defiant, simply truthful. His final memory described walking home after the video went public, and seeing people on their phones whispering, estimating which family he belonged to. That, he said, felt worse than any grave. The silence that followed his words was so thick it pressed on everyone inside. No one spoke. Lawyers closed their folders. Reporters lowered cameras. The judge blinked. The gallery heaved a collective breath, like a world exhaling after too long holding dread. In that pause, justice didn't yet exist, but truth did. Then came the unexpected twist. As the district seemed cornered, their lead attorney attempted a last-minute rescue, produced a set of emails supposedly showing prior praise for Travian's writing. Before the day of humiliation, They argued that the district had supported excellence regardless of race, painting the video as isolated. But the moment they displayed the documents, Adriana stood. She slid a folder across the bench. Official school correspondences proving those emails had been drafted after the video leak. The timestamps, the metadata frozen in time. The judge leaned forward. The defense lawyer's face drained. Their proof crumbled in live motion. The room felt the walls shift. After a long trembling silence, the judge cleared his throat, straightened his robe, and spoke. Evidence of systemic bias, corroborated testimonies, and the video footage combined to show more than a single error. A pattern of racial discrimination. The verdict itself would come the next morning, but the tone in the courtroom had changed. A calm that didn't signal closure, but impending consequence. As people filed out, cameras following, reporters shouting questions, a lone figure lingered just outside the courthouse doors. A man in a dark jacket, face half-shadowed under a hood. He watched Lila and Travion step into the sunlight, shining relief across their faces. He stayed distant, hands in pockets, eyes cold, no flash, no roar, only a silent observation. The sensation of a chill passing unnoticed, but profound. Lila didn't see him. Travion didn't feel him. But somewhere beyond the crowd, beyond the cheers and the tears, something waited. Something quiet. Something patient. Inside the car on the ride home, Lila held her grandson's trembling hand. She didn't speak. Words felt small after today. Instead, she glanced at the rearview mirror as the sun slipped behind clouds, and saw the man walking away from the courthouse, silhouette shrinking into the crowd. Her heart lurched. She didn't know who he was. She didn't know what he wanted. But she knew justice might be near, but danger often hides behind closure. That night, Lila locked all doors, checked the windows, and hovered outside Trevion's room until he fell asleep. Every creak in the house felt loud. Every shadow looked like a stain, rubbing against the wall. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching him breathe, hoping for peace, but bracing for impact. Because in that flicker of calm after the storm, the unknown remained. The figure outside, the hungering silence, the possibility that a verdict meant little if fear could creep in. Afterward, cliffhanger. And as the court prepared to issue its sentence the next day, the one that could reshape the district forever, a single anonymous message appeared in Lila's inbox. Judgment doesn't protect you. Retribution still walks free. By the time the Department of Education's investigation officially launched its first interviews, Dalton was no longer just a town under scrutiny. It was a town on edge. The sidewalks no longer felt neutral. Grocery stores echoed with glances that lasted a beat too long. Street corners bore the tension of unsaid things. The support for Lila and Travion had been loud, visible, and powerful, but so had the backlash. And now the silence that used to mean apathy began to feel more like warning. The first act of retaliation came quietly. Lila's car, parked in front of her home, had its windows shattered late at night. Nothing was stolen, not even her wallet, which she had accidentally left in the center console. It was targeted, not random, a message dressed as destruction. When she reported it, the officer who came seemed polite but distant, almost reluctant to document it. Could have been teenagers, he offered. She didn't respond. She knew what it was. They both did. Days later, Adriana's tires were slashed. All four. She found them early one morning, before school. Rubber flayed open like soft meat. No note. No witnesses. No surprise. The timing was too perfect. She hadn't been back inside a classroom since the resignation. But she'd been active online, organizing data, helping the legal team, and publishing receipts the district had failed to redact. She knew retaliation was inevitable, but she hadn't expected it to be so surgical. Then came the attack that jolted even the most disengaged. Reverend Marcus Bell, the local pastor who had opened his church doors for organizing meetings and publicly defended Travion during a sermon, was assaulted outside his home. Not robbed, not mugged, just struck hard by two masked figures who fled before police could arrive. He survived with a cracked rib and a swollen eye, but the community took it as a sign. The gloves were off. This wasn't just racism hiding behind policies anymore. It was rage unmasked. The retaliation didn't stop at property or people. A smear campaign began circulating. Flyers slipped into mailboxes, anonymous Facebook posts, whispered lies at parent meetings, claims that Lila had coached Travion, that Adriana had falsified evidence for attention, that Reverend Bell had manipulated the church to promote division. None of it held truth. But in times of fear, truth becomes negotiable. Rumors moved faster than facts. Churches chose sides. One congregation printed a bulletin discouraging political activism from the pulpit. Another held a prayer circle for misguided children. Others doubled down in support, organizing tutoring programs, community healing circles, and mental health resources. The town, once neatly suburban and slow-moving, now trembled like a cracked plate under too much pressure. Inside this fractured atmosphere, Trevion watched everything unfold from the corner of his window. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. He understood now that even when the truth wins, it doesn't arrive without blood. Justice, he realized, wasn't a ribbon-cutting ceremony. It was a battle with no rules and no guarantees. It came late. It came expensive. And sometimes, it came with loss too deep to measure. He saw how Lila carried herself. Spine straight, voice measured, but also how her hands shook when she thought no one was looking. He saw Adriana speak on live streams with conviction, but return to her apartment with locks double-checked and lights never turned off. He saw Reverend Bell, still limping from his injuries, smile for the press while flinching at loud noises. Dalton wasn't healing. It was cracking wider. The lawsuit against the school district moved forward, inch by inch. Depositions began. Lawyers grilled board members. Records surfaced that had mysteriously vanished from school files. The deeper the investigation went, the more it exposed fraudulent hiring practice, discriminatory grading trends, even internal communications where students were labeled with coded words, high energy, entitled, difficult at home, all disproportionately applied to black children. But while justice sharpened its blade in courtrooms and newsrooms, the town frayed. A local teacher who voiced support for Lila was transferred. A guidance counselor who emailed the Department of Education was fired for unrelated performance issues. Parents once friendly with Lila stopped responding to messages. One even told her, eyes avoiding hers at the grocery store, "I just don't want my family caught in the middle of all this." Caught in the middle. That phrase lingered with her. Because Trevion hadn't asked for any of this. He hadn't volunteered to be a symbol or a martyr. He had written an essay, that was all. But because that essay was too powerful, because it wasn't packaged the way they expected from a black boy, he was now caught in the middle of a war to prove his humanity. As the trial date approached, tension coiled across Dalton, like a live wire. No one knew what the judge would say. The district had tried everything to minimize the case, offered settlements, dismissed certain claims, even attempted to suppress the video under educational privacy violation. But Lila had refused to settle. Not because she wanted revenge, but because she had seen too many settlements become sealed silences. This time she wanted it on record. She wanted it to be undeniable. The courthouse steps became a regular meeting ground. Protesters with signs, reporters with questions, lawyers with briefcases, students with hope written across their shirts. "Let them write," one read. "I am not your exception," another. The movement had grown, but so had the resistance. Online forums overflowed with anonymous messages calling the case a witch hunt, calling Trevion manipulated, calling Lila a race baiter. She didn't respond to any of it. She focused on Trevion, on truth, on the letter that started it all. Then one quiet morning, the judge was ready. It was a Wednesday. Overcast sky. Courthouse packed. The courtroom itself was standing room only. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but reporters filled the benches, scribbling notes as quickly as they could. On one side, the district's lawyers sat rigid, suits tight, expressions unreadable. On the other, Lila sat between Adriana and Trevion, his hand wrapped in hers like they were tethered by more than blood now, by survival. The judge entered, papers shuffled. The room inhaled, and then he read the verdict. And when the final sentence dropped, it didn't just break the silence, it broke the room. The court gasped, reporters froze, and Lila, for the first time in this fight, covered her mouth in disbelief. Because the judge's ruling didn't just favor Trevion. It did something no one expected. It named the district's actions a violation of federal civil rights law, ordered Mr. Langston's permanent revocation of his teaching license, and mandated a public reading of Trevion's essay at the next school board meeting. As a reminder, because of the rules we agreed on, I cannot add direct character-to-character dialogue. I can only write in third-person cinematic narration. No quoted dialogue. The courtroom was quiet the moment the judge's gavel struck. The echo filled the tall, wood-paneled chamber, hung there in the air like waking thunder. For a long beat no one moved, And then the verdict rolled out. Clear, unambiguous. Historic. The judge ruled in favor of Trevian Jackson and his grandmother Lila Jackson, labeling the actions of the school district, the years of targeting, suppression, and dismissal, as a violation of civil rights under federal law. A wave of release washed over the room. Relief, vindication, sorrow, anger, all flowing together in silence and tears. Trevian lowered his head, shoulders trembling with the weight of memory and hope. Lila closed her eyes, steadying herself so she wouldn't cry in public. Around them, the walls that had once held whispering secrets now held a verdict that spoke louder than all the lies. Outside the courtroom, reporters flooded the hallway. Cameras flashed, microphones rose, questions poured like rain. The district's lawyers looked pale, defeated. They had once dismissed this case as a minor dispute, a misunderstanding, a momentary lapse in judgment. But the judgment they now faced was bigger than words. It carried legal consequences, public shame, and the force of federal authority. Mr. Langston's name was struck from the district's roster immediately. Teaching license revoked, pension benefits frozen pending further review. A public notice read at the district office. Short, sterile, almost bureaucratic, but behind each line was the end of a career built on fear, camouflage, and unspoken prejudice. Superintendent Harold Kern handed in his resignation that very afternoon. The letter he submitted was terse. No apology. No acknowledgement of responsibility. Only a line about stepping down to allow the district to rebuild trust. It felt hollow, even to those who wanted to believe in forgiveness. In the wake of the verdict, sweeping reforms began before anyone expected. The school board convened an emergency session that evening. Under pressure from parents, activists, and the new federal oversight, they enacted policies that replaced vague disciplinary guidelines with transparent, equity-based standards. Anonymous reporting channels were established and promised confidentiality. Anti-bias training was scheduled for every teacher, administrator, and support staff across all schools in the district. Grading rubrics were reviewed. Disciplinary reports, once hidden or ignored, were now cataloged, tracked, and subject to audit. For the first time in decades, the district's air felt different, colder, cleaner, like a house finally opened for fresh wind after years of stale windows. But beyond the legalities and the policy sheets, something deeper shifted. In Milton Middle, black students began to speak softly at first, then louder, with strength they had buried under fear. Essays appeared on desks, personal projects driven by pride, instead of caution. Teachers, some hesitant, others sincere, walked the halls differently, eyes more mindful. Some approached students they had once ignored, offering help, encouragement, or just a nod of recognition. Those nods, small as they seemed, carried the weight of possibility. The cafeteria changed first. Conversations that had once skirted around race, ambition, difference, now flowed openly. Students talked about bias, about identity, about dreams they were told not to have. The atmosphere was fragile but real. For the first time, many saw themselves not as exceptions, but as part of a story being rewritten. At home, Lila watched Trevian slowly return. He didn't bounce back overnight. Healing wasn't a switch. Some days he still stared blankly at walls. But gradually, he picked up a notebook again. His first page back was tentative. A few lines, smudged by hesitation. But on the second day, the words came firmer. A paragraph, then a page, then more. Not for school, not for approval, but because he needed to be seen. For himself this time. One afternoon, Lila found him sitting at the kitchen table, writing quietly, sunlight catching the dust motes around his head like gentle spotlights. He didn't look up when she came in. She only watched, and after a moment she backed away, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace. She knew then that healing might not mean forgetting, but reclaiming. The local community's reaction sliced through the victory with complexity. There were celebrations, rallies, speeches, concerts of solidarity, support from civil rights organizations, but also backlash. Some parents pulled their children out of Milton Middle. Some families moved away. Some threatened lawsuits of their own, accusing the district of defamation, claiming the verdict would ruin reputations and make all teachers suspect. Churches split, friendships cracked, bonds frayed. Even Lila wondered sometimes, was the cost worth it? She recalled nights of tears, of phone calls threatening their safety, of broken glass, slashed tires, whispered hate. She remembered Travian's nightmares, his detachment, his pain. She remembered feeling helpless, even while fighting. The question haunted her. Victory for what? The future, or what had already been lost? But then she saw what was happening among the children. The ones who had once believed silence was safety. The ones who now dared to raise their voices. They smiled. They wrote. They walked through the halls with their heads slightly higher. They greeted teachers. They didn't cower. They existed instead of shrinking. She realized that was the real win. Not the verdict, not the headlines, not even the policy changes. It was the freedom to be unapologetic, to exist without fear, to believe that brilliance was never a crime, that identity was never a fault, that being black was never a question of merit. As winter crept in, the district organized a memorial within the school, not for Travian, but for all the students whose voices had been silenced. They hung a plaque outside the main hall, in memory of every dream cut short. May silence no longer be the lesson. On the day it was unveiled, Lila stood beside Travian, his hand in hers, their faces calm but proud. Parents, students, teachers, community members, many stood back, uncertain, but watching. Some with tears, some with shame, many with hope. A reporter asked Lila for her final thoughts. She didn't quote anything. She looked at the plaque, at the crowd, then at Travian. In her eyes was fire. Not anger, but something steadier, something lasting. She didn't promise fairness. Not yet. She didn't promise the pain would vanish. She only promised one thing, that this story would be remembered. That the children of this district would know their value before a teacher had to prove it. But as the crowd dispersed and the cameras packed up, a lone figure lingered by the edge of the small gathering. A former parent who had once defended the district, now silent, staring at Travian's face. The look in his eyes was tight, calculating, unresolved. Doubt, maybe, or resentment, or the flicker of defiance. Lila sensed it too. A ripple in the air that didn't belong to hope. She tightened her grip on Travian's hand, beneath the plaque. She knew this fight was won, for now, but she also knew battles like this didn't end with court verdicts. They ended only when a community truly changed. And as they turned to leave the ceremony, the former parent stepped forward and dropped a sealed envelope at the base of the plaque. Lila knelt down, glanced at Travian, and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, with one sentence written in shaky black ink. This victory belongs to you, but the next one belongs to them. The morning air in Dalton carried a fragile calm. It was the kind of stillness that follows storms, the trembling hush when the wind finally dies, but the sky stays gray and unsettled. In that haze, Jackson Learning Initiative was born. Lila Jackson sat at her old kitchen table, the legal papers scattered around her like fallen leaves from years of injustice. She didn't see a broken system. She saw a seedbed for change. She drafted its mission slowly. Mentorship for Black youth, racial empathy training for teachers, safe spaces for truth, not silence. She imagined classrooms where brilliance wasn't judged by color, where curiosity wasn't punished, and where every child could write without fear. Within weeks, the initiative found unexpected allies. Local churches donated meeting space. A retired Black school counselor offered pro bono coaching. A few courageous teachers volunteered for the empathy training workshops. The first workshop filled within days. More than 50 educators squeezed into the modest community center. Some came because they believed, some came to see if it mattered. But all left unsettled, unsure, thinking differently than when they entered. Conversations that had never been had began emerging, about fairness, bias, privilege, and the gaps in understanding. Meanwhile, Milton Middle School, the very building where Travian had been humiliated, underwent its own transformation. The Writing Center, renamed the Travian Jackson Writing Center, opened in a sunlit wing of the school. Its walls were bright, the furniture new, the air intentionally different. On the grand opening day, Lila stood beside Travian, watching as students trickled in. Some black, some white, some curious, some cautious, each one greeted by a sign that read, "Your words matter." The moment felt surreal, a monument carved out of pain, now promising possibility. Travian himself became something the school had never expected. A mentor, not because he overcame, but because he chose to rise. He sat with younger students, listened to their ideas, encouraged them to speak before fear silenced them. He didn't preach, He didn't lecture. He simply showed up as someone who had been broken, who knew how it felt to shrink, and who refused to let others do the same. In his quiet way, he became proof that brilliance could survive cruelty, that a child's voice could echo after being silenced. Years passed. The district's anti-bias training became a regular fixture. New teachers were vetted not only for qualifications, but for empathy records. Evaluations included sensitivity, fairness, willingness to listen. Disciplinary records became public, transparent, reviewed by parents and community members. The old patterns, coded comments, selective punishment, suspicion of black excellence, slowly began to fade, replaced by an accountability the district once ignored. Success stories emerged. A sophomore whose poem about her grandmother's migration won regional recognition. A ninth-grade debate team, led by a former student who once feared speaking up in class. A reading program, volunteer who helped a boy read fluently by 10th grade, the kind of growth that textbooks don't track but lives. The initiative grew beyond Dalton. Neighboring towns asked for training. City teachers requested the curriculum. Grant proposals came. The small seed Lila planted became a root system reaching across counties. But legacy is never easy. Progress invites resistance. Not always loud. Sometimes slow, insidious. Some alumni refused to believe the change. They argued the initiative shamed teachers and painted the district as guilty before proof. Some parents pulled their children from Milton Middle, sending them to private schools or districts far away. Others complained the new writing center was too centered on one boy's experience. Some whispered that the pain was being turned into a spectacle. Lila heard their whispers. She saw their faces in grocery aisles and soccer fields. She felt the weight of their judgment in every PTA meeting she attended for the initiative. She realized that change, even at its best, carries costs. And sometimes the cost is the quiet comfort of people who preferred silence to truth. Then one afternoon, unexpected, unannounced, a letter arrived at Lila's door from a teacher who once worked under the old system. She was white, had taught English for decades, and had remained silent throughout the scandal for fear of being ostracized. Now she wrote to say that something about the initiative had made her remember. She described her guilt for dismissing a black student's paper 5 years earlier, a paper she had marked down as unrealistic. The student had dropped out soon after. The teacher said she was sorry, asked for forgiveness, and requested permission to volunteer at the writing center. She enclosed a manuscript, unfinished, raw but full of regret and hope. Lila read the letter on her porch, hands trembling. The paper felt thick with what-ifs. The tears came quietly, then stopped, because this time they didn't feel like grief. They felt like beginning. She mailed back her acceptance. She didn't promise healing. She promised a seat at the table. In the writing center, during one of the mentorship sessions, a young boy walked in quietly. He tore at the edge of his sleeve, eyes downcast. He said nothing, didn't introduce himself, just picked a blank page and laid it on the table. Trevian sat across from him, silent as well. After a long moment, he nodded. He watched the boy close his eyes, breathe deep, and then begin to write. At first one word, then another, then a sentence, then a page. The room stayed quiet. Compassion sat beside ambition. Hope flickered, and through the windows, the afternoon light looked kinder than it ever had. But even in moments of hope, the past doesn't leave without warning. One morning Lila arrived at the initiative's small office, and found the door ajar. Nothing stolen, nothing broken, just a sticky note stuck to the desk, written in shaky black ink. Burn the voices. Let silence heal. She picked it up slowly, thumb tracing the letters. A chill settled in the room. She dropped the note into her pocket. She didn't show it to anyone. She didn't speak of it. But she felt it. The reminder that change is never safe. That truth rearranges, but it can't erase the ghost. Still, she pressed on. Because legacy isn't built on fear. It's built on stubborn belief. On the decision to refuse silence. On the willingness to keep standing, even when the wind turns cold again. Years later, at a community gathering, where parents, students, volunteers, and teachers mingled under strings of lights, Lila looked around and saw faces she had once known. Some older now, some with children she never met. They carried stories. Not all stories ended happy, but many carried beginnings. In small voices, in new essays, in conversations about identity and justice, in the way Black youth no longer flinched when called on to read aloud. The air felt different. softer, more alive. Travion stood by the wall, watching the laughter, the clapping, the chatter. His gaze drifted to a little girl sitting on a step, reading a poem she had just written. Her fingers traced the words slowly, reverently. When she looked up, their eyes met. She nodded. He nodded back. No words, just recognition. Lila stood beside them, cane laid against the wall, standing straight, even though age had curled her spine. Her eyes glistened with hope and grief both. Hope for what was happening now, grief for what had been lost, for the children who didn't survive the doubt, for the brilliance buried before it had a chance to shine. She breathed in, deep and steady. The night air smelled of possibility, of paper and ink, of quiet rooms where truth would be written again. Because this legacy wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about punishment. It was about change, about remembrance, about building a space where genius didn't come with a warning label, where being smart wasn't dangerous, where being black wasn't a question. It was a foundation. As lanterns glowed and voices rose in laughter and conversation, Lila reached into her pocket. She pulled out the sticky note, the threat left at the office. She crumpled it, folded it, let it fall to the ground. Footsteps passed. Shadows shifted. No one noticed. But in that moment, she realized something. Threats don't end legacy. Silence does. And silence was no longer an option. Because across the country, another classroom is sitting in uneasy hush. Another child is watching the clock, afraid to raise their hand. And somewhere, someone is deciding whether to be the next voice. Will they speak, or will they stay silent? If you believe no child should be punished for their brilliance, type yes in the comments. What would you do if this happened to someone you love? Subscribe for more true stories that demand justice and keep the conversation alive. Because the fight against silence starts with us.